right, team. So apologies again. I know these are not your favorite ways to do notes, but it's better than nothing and forcing you guys to try and do it on your own. Sorry, there's a bear head up there, so I'll try to move. So these are going to be the last two sections of notes. I just want to power through them, and then we are officially done with notes for the rest of bio, unless you plan on taking bio 30, and then you get a whole bunch more. And then tomorrow's class, you guys can use that to review and work on your cheat sheets for your test on Thursday, which is on everything that's in this note package. So all of the population change stuff that we started with, where we had the different levels of classification. So your domain, kingdom, phylum, class. Can't remember it without my saying, sorry. And talking about the use of a dichotomous key. So remembering you get two options and you have to kind of choose your option until you eventually figure out what your species is. A phylogenetic tree, knowing that when it branches, the things that are closest together are the most closely related. The things that are farthest apart are least related. And where the branch happens means that there was some sort of common ancestor, which I will explain how a common ancestor can eventually turn into two different species. Also, if I'm making weird faces or something, I can't move very well because I hurt my back, which is why I wasn't there yesterday. So today we are going back to what you guys did yesterday, which are the evidences of evolution and your theories of evolution. So you will need to know the 5 different evidences of evolution for your quiz on Thursday and know a couple of just little details about each one. So for fossil evidence, knowing that there's a fossil record and that at some point in time in the fossil record, there's evidence showing that all of the continents on the planet were just one giant supercontinent, and that the fossil record and biogeography are kind of linked together through the fossils themselves. And they do again provide evidence that the continents were together because there's fossils that are found in Antarctica that are also found in Australia, some that are found in India that are also found in South America. So just thinking about it logically, at some point they had to be close to each other for them to actually be on these different parts of the world. You also talked about biochemistry, which is just comparing DNA, and we're going to get a little bit more into DNA today. Again, the more closely related the sequences of DNA are, so the most letters they have in common, the more closely related they are. The less letters they have in common, the less related. And artificial selection was one of the other things that you guys talked about, which again is just looking at how humans can pick specific traits to make certain things that we want. So the process of farming and the fact that all of the different things like broccoli and cauliflower and kohlrabi and kale all technically come from one plant, that we just selected certain traits that we wanted from them to eventually make all of these other vegetables. Same with dogs, same with cats, same with horses, same with cows. All of the breeding that we do, we are picking specific traits to try and make our lives better, or to make things cuter, or, give us more food, okay? More things to eat. From there, you guys went to talking about the 2 different theories of evolution. There's more, but those are just the 2 that we focus on. You have Lamarck's theory, and Lamarck, again, looked at acquired characteristics. So things that you gain throughout your lifetime, you can pass on to your kids. So again, if you dyed your hair blue, then your kid would have blue hair. If you decided to cut off a foot, then your kid would be born without a foot, okay? It sounds kind of ridiculous, but it was something that people believed in for quite a while because there weren't any other explanations really going into what was going on. And then that led to Mr. Charles Darwin, who again is the father of evolution. And you do need to know both those names. So Darwin and Lamarck, you guys need to know them. You need to know as much as you can about them, because I am going to ask you guys to compare their theories. So where Lamarck thought acquired characteristics were a thing, Darwin thought natural selection was a thing. And the theory of natural selection led into the development of the theory of evolution. So natural selection, again, is not evolution. It's not saying that it is evolution. It's just saying that nature selects for the best traits that improve the chances of survival. So again, I am really, 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 really hoping that I will be at school tomorrow. As long as everything works out, I should be there. And we can kind of review everything that we've talked about over the last couple of days, because I know it can be really difficult to listen to these video lessons. And I know that sometimes your brains just shut off and you don't want to listen to me. But try your best, please, because this is the last little bit and it is going to be a pretty large part of your final exam after the break. So going forward, we're going to look today at mutations, and we're going to look at something called speciation, which is how we can actually create a new species. Well, we don't create it, but how a new species forms. So natural selection, again, says that individuals that are better adapted to their environment, so have traits that allow them to survive better, are going to contribute more offspring to the next generation, because usually if you are being alive, you are able to potentially have babies, whereas if you are dead, you are not having babies. So things that help to increase your survival is going to help you to pass on your genetic information. And the offspring that these individuals have will also carry the genes that have these adaptations, which means they're probably going to be better adapted to that environment, which means that they are also going to have more babies, and so on and so forth. And over an extended period of time, then that can impact the species as a whole versus just select individuals. And then that is the process of evolution, when it's impacting the entire species, not just, 2 or 3 individuals. So again, natural selection can only happen if there's actual differences in a population. So if you are a population of bacteria and you are all completely identical, you are a bunch of different same little clones of each other, natural selection isn't going to do anything, because you're all the same. So you're either all going to survive or you're all going to die. As soon as there's differences, though, so looking at bacteria and thinking of antibiotic resistance, nature is going to select for the antibiotic resistant ones, because they are able to survive the drugs that people are taking to try and, kill off the bacteria so that they can get better. So benefiting survival, that is natural selection, okay? And where do the differences or variations come from? It basically comes down to genetics, which is something we get a lot more into in Bio 30. And these differences can come from 2 main processes. You have your mutations, which is completely random, or you have sexual reproduction, where you have 2 different sources of genetic information combining to make a brand new unique source of information. And also, if you guys are wondering, I am drawing some pictures for you. I do realize I forgot to post the one from yesterday, whatever Monday was. So I will post that under today's post on Google Classroom as well. So just so you guys are aware, but DNA is found in our chromosomes, or more accurately, our DNA turns into chromosomes. So your chromosomes are DNA, they're just special packages of DNA. Because DNA usually looks like a giant pile of spaghetti 99% of the time, and there is a whole lot of it. You guys have about 2 meters worth in each of your cells. Like 2 meters, so like 6 feet worth, almost like it's a lot of information. And it needs to be packaged all nicely into some fancy chromosomes. And I'm actually going to share this one instead, if I can. There we go. So this is a cell. Okay, in the middle, you have your nucleus. And in the nucleus is the DNA. And then the DNA again gets packaged into these nice little chromosomes. Humans have 46. So our DNA just gets packaged into 46 of these little weird squishy line looking things. And depending on the chromosomes you have, that is going to impact the genetics that you have. So yes, my brain is dying a little bit. On your chromosomes, when you zoom in on them even more, they have a bunch of these kind of binding patterns. Some of the lines are going to be really, really dark, and some are not. These are genes. So your genes are like your hair color, your eye color, your skin color, your blood type. All of those things are found in these genes. Some traits that you have use multiple genes to give you what you want. Your eye color, for example, comes from 11 different genes, which is why eye color is annoying when you're trying to explain how the inheritance pattern works. But the genes, again, you get from your parents, and they determine what traits you have. If something happens in the DNA sequence or the DNA strand that makes up these genes, that can change what genes we're looking at and like give us blue eyes instead of green eyes, or brown eyes instead of gray eyes. Okay. All of that stuff comes from changes in the DNA sequences themselves. So there are 4 bases of DNA. This is not new information to you guys. You've learned about it in, for sure, grade 9 and a little bit in grade 10. You might have learned about it earlier, but you have these 4 bases that make up the kind of stairs of the ladder of your DNA molecule. You have A, T, G, and C, which is adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine. It's good for you guys to remember what the letters actually stand for. And it's also good to know what binds with what. So A is always going to bind, with T, and G is always going to bind with C. So this is always, always, always the case. It comes down to the molecular structure as to why this happens. But this is very important, and it's changes in these letters and the order of these letters that can lead to mutations. Okay, sorry. So the order of the bases, again, forms a code. This code gives us our specific traits, and that is what makes up our genes. So your DNA, again, is kind of like a little blueprint for every single particular person. So our specific genetic code leads to exactly who we are and all of the different physical things that we have to showcase in our appearance. I'm sorry, my brain is very dying right now. So most of the time, the DNA that you have is going to stay the same for your entire lifetime. But once in a while, things can cause it to change, and then those changes can potentially lead to adaptations. And you are going to pass those changes onto your offspring. When that happens, when one individual has a mutation and passes it on to like 2 or 3 other individuals, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to cause evolution instantaneously. It's not going to be like, ooh, this person now has like blue eyes and now the whole world is going to have blue eyes. The only time mutations are going to lead to anything is when it takes like hundreds to thousands of generations and that mutation starts to build up in that population. And we have 2 main causes of mutations. The first one is the environment. Okay, you can have changes to your DNA caused by UV radiation, for example, so radiation from the sun, and that can potentially lead to the development of skin cancer because it mutates your skin cell DNA, and sometimes that can lead to bad things like cancer. Most of the time, people think of mutations as bad things, but sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. So that's an important thing to remember because without mutations, we literally would have 0 differences in our appearances. And replication errors are another thing. So we also call these spontaneous mutations. They happen completely randomly. We have no control over them, just like we have no control over the environmental ones. So not everyone who gets exposed to UV light is going to get skin cancer, but some people do. So the thing to be aware of is that mutations happen, okay? We can't control them. We can't say, all right, we're going to just mutate these things and make this fancy new organism. We can change genes around in a lab in a different way, but that's something we'll talk about later. But when it comes to mutations, no control. It just happens or it doesn't. And there are a lot of types of mutations. In Bio 30, we get into 8 different types that we're going to talk about. We're just going to talk about the very, very basic types of mutations in Bio 20. Again, they are rare. They don't happen to every single person, and it takes a very long time for these mutations to build up in a population because, again, natural selection is not an instantaneous process, and it does take time. So the 3 main types of mutations that you guys are going to need to know are very, very general categories. You have harmful mutations that are going to harm the individual, not necessarily physically, but they're just going to harm their chances at reproduction. Neutral mutations are neutral. They do nothing. Okay, they don't change anything. They maybe change one letter in your DNA, and that one letter happens to cause 0 changes in the protein that it's eventually going to make. And then beneficial mutations are going to increase reproductive success. So bio, again, it's all about, can you have babies and reproduction? So if you are having things that increase that reproduction, that's going to increase the chance of natural selection, and it's going to increase your chance of survival. Harmful ones, sometimes they can kill you, sometimes they give you diseases. Okay, they're going to harm you in some way or another and eventually lead to you not being able to have as much reproductive success because you're either hurt or dead. So this table you guys don't need to memorize, but you do need to understand kind of the misconception versus the understandings that we have with the evidence that we've collected over the years. So some people think that mutations occur when we need them. Again, not true, because we have no control over them. They happen randomly, okay? There's no rhyme or reason to it. They just happen. If we could control them, I feel like we wouldn't have as many harmful ones. Since harmful mutations are more common than beneficial mutations, they're going to build up in a species. Also wrong, because again, harmful mutations are the things that are decreasing reproductive success, which means that if you are not able to have a baby, that means that you're not passing on that harmed, mutated genetic information to anybody else, which means it's going to eventually disappear from the population, depending on if you can have babies or not. And since mutations are random, then evolution is just pure chance. So evolution is also random. But even though beneficial mutations aren't as common, nature is going to select for them because, again, usually beneficial mutations are going to increase your reproductive success. I'm struggling with that word today. And if you are reproducing, you are passing on your genetic information to your offspring, and then those offspring are going to then have beneficial traits that are going to allow them to also have an increased chance of reproducing, and so on and so forth. And again, given enough time, that mutation is going to build up in the population, and that can eventually lead to the development of a new species. Okay. So as I said, mutations are one way that we can get changes and variations in a population. The other way is through sexual reproduction. So bacteria cells and a few other single-celled organisms and a few other things like a hydra organism, which lives underwater, they reproduce using asexual reproduction, which is essentially cloning. Okay, you're making identical copies of yourselves, and there's 0 differences unless a mutation happens. So the only way an asexual reproducing species can have change is through mutations. And so since an asexually reproducing population is making identical clones, if there is something that's going to harm one of them, that is probably going to harm all of them and can wipe out the species completely. So there are pros to reproducing asexually because, again, you don't have to find a mate. You don't really need a whole lot of time. You don't need a lot of resources. But there's a huge downside because, again, if you die, then everybody dies, which is not a great time. Okay, so sexually reproducing organisms on the, when comparing it to asexually reproducing organisms is much different. You are taking, again, DNA from two different individuals, and you are combining that DNA from those two individuals so that they can kind of mix and match and create a brand new genetically unique individual. This reproduction is what, again, gives us some variability in our populations. This is why you don't look exactly the same as the people in the classroom. It's also why you don't look exactly like your parents or exactly like your siblings, but you have a lot of similarities to them. Okay? We have a lot of traits that natural selection can act on, so there's a lot of changes that can occur in our populations. Okay, so 3 reasons why we get variation or differences from sexual reproduction. I've already said this one. So the offspring is going to have 2 copies of each gene. So you get DNA from the mom or the female, you get DNA from the dad or the male, and those DNA chromosome bits are going to pair up together to give you a brand new, again, chromosome kind of formation. And you're only getting half of the DNA from your mom and half of the DNA from your dad, and it's completely random as to which half you get. And then when we mush those 2 copies together, depending on if you have dominant genes or recessive genes, that is going to impact, again, which traits you have in your DNA and which traits you're going to express. So you get 2 copies, and it is random as to which copies you get. And then lastly, you are choosing who you decide to have offspring with. So you have different mates. Somehow in some species, you're picking them based on specific physical kind of structures that they have or physical things that they do to determine if they have good genes and if it's a good idea to have babies with them. Okay. So that's mutations. The biggest point that you guys need to get out of that is just understanding how we get differences in a population so that, going back to yesterday, natural selection can then act on those differences, figuring out what is beneficial to the environment at that time so that those differences can increase in the population. And if given enough time, we could potentially develop a new species through this process of speciation. Alrighty. So a species, if we look at the definition of what a species is, it is a population of individuals who are reproductively isolated, which means they can only reproduce with each other, and they are not able to breed with other species in a natural kind of situation. So dogs can breed with dogs, cats can breed with cats, but dogs and cats can't breed together because they're not the same species. And most species are made throughout this process called allopatric speciation. There are 3 steps to this process. You will need to know the 3 steps. I can't remember if it's for your quiz or for your exam when we get back after the break, but star these 3 steps coming up. All right, so step 1, you need a barrier. So you need geographical isolation where you are separating the population into 2 different groups. Okay, depending on the group that we're looking at or the species we're looking at, the barriers can be really, really big, like a mountain, or they can be really, really small, like a river, depending again on what the species is that we're looking at. Step 2 is natural selection. And natural selection is going to act on each of the populations separately because, again, they've been moved away from each other. The environment's now going to be different. One group might get more water. One group might get more, sunlight. Okay. One group might end up with acidic soil versus basic soil. Okay. We might get acid rain over here and get regular rain over here. All of those different environmental pressures are going to cause changes in those populations. And because they're different, because of the geographic locations of the populations, natural selection is going to pick different things for each of those populations because the environment's not the same. Okay, and then the last thing we need for speciation to happen is a whole lot of time. Okay, again, most of the time, like thousands to tens of thousands of generations worth of time. So as time goes by, again, natural selection is acting on these populations separately, picking different traits that are more beneficial to the survival of those individuals. And eventually, there's going to be so many differences between these two populations based on sexual reproduction and built-up mutations that if these two groups were to come back together and potentially tried to reproduce, it wouldn't work. Okay, they're no longer sexually compatible. They can no longer have babies together that can have their own babies. And at that point, they have become a distinct new species. So when we're talking about the phylogenetic tree, so going back in time to last week when we talked about those phylogenetic trees, and I'm just going to change over to this really quick. Again, I'm going to share all of this stuff with you guys so you'll have it later. But if we have this phylogenetic tree like this, and if we were to zoom in on this specific section, okay, here at this branch, there is a common ancestor, so an original population. Again, poppin', it's population, I'm just lazy. Some sort of environmental thing has happened, or we have been isolated, / we've split this population. Okay, again, once we've isolated or split them, natural selection is going to act on each population separately, give it a long enough period of time, and we're going to see that divergence into two new species. Some species that are really closely related can still technically mate, so they can still technically have babies. So if you have a lion and a tiger, they can technically mate, and they do mate in the wild, not just in like human-driven situations. And they do have babies, and those babies are called ligers, and they are adorable. You can also have a zebra and a donkey and get a zonkey, so they're kind of cute. But these babies are considered hybrids, and that is not how we make a new species because these babies are sterile, which means that they cannot have their own babies. Okay? If they're a male, they can't produce sperm cells. If they're a female, they can't produce egg cells. So even though they have been created through a mating of two different parents, of two different species, they cannot have their own babies. If you look at mules, for example, so horses and donkeys to make a mule, there is no situation where two mules mate together and have little baby mules because they can't. So when we're mixing the genetic information, even though they're super, super close, They're still different enough to make them different species, which means that they are not sexually compatible and they cannot have their own viable offspring. Hopefully that makes sense. And as I've mentioned already, these physical barriers that can happen to split these populations can range in size. Human construction can cause speciation to happen or start the process of speciation because we are making geographic barriers for some organisms, but that doesn't always happen. Speciation, again, can be a sudden process where it wasn't planned and all of a sudden something just drastically separates these populations that came out of nowhere. And again, once the populations are separated, mutations are going to build up in those populations separately based on just the random business of mutations. And then again, we're going to have the environmental pressures that are going to lead to natural selection. And then eventually, again, over a long period of time, we're going to have 2 brand new species that can't have working babies. So this video is a very good video. I'm going to share this video with TH, and you guys can pause the video or pause the lesson right now, watch this video, and then we'll come back and finish the last couple of things. But I think that the video shows really, really well how this whole speciation process can happen. So hopefully that video worked and that this isn't just like a weird split. So the last thing we're going to look at are rates of evolution and a couple of types of evolution, because again, we use evolution as a very kind of blanket term, but it means a whole bunch of different things depending on what we're looking at. So one of the rates of evolution, and in your question package, it comes up as just like I have it written as just gradualism. If you are looking for a definition of it, look up the theory of gradualism or gradualism theory, and you'll be able to figure out what that is. But this theory of gradualism is basically that evolution happens by just very small changes in a species over a long period of time. And if this theory was valid, we would see a bunch of kind of intermediate fossils where you have your common ancestor or the original species, and we'd see a bunch of differences in the fossils before it becomes something brand new. There is some evidence of this in the fossil record, but not a ton. So we don't know really what the rate of evolution actually is because the fossil record is incomplete. But this is one theory of how it happens. That it's slow, it's gradual, and we can see the changes in the fossil record. The second rate of evolution theory that we're going to look at is called punctuated equilibrium. This one is more accepted in paleontology when we're looking at the fossil record. And it has kind of 3 main points to it. You don't need to memorize these points, but they're good to understand. And this is that species evolve very quickly, usually because some sort of drastic environmental pressure happens where they have to adapt very quickly or else they're going to go extinct. So rapid evolution due to massive change. And once we have this initial burst of evolution, so we have this massive amount of new species show up in the fossil record, there's long periods of time where there is not any change and we don't see anything. Because this is happening so quickly, those intermediate fossils that were proposed with gradualism, we don't see them and they don't happen, or they are extremely rare. And if you look at the pictures that I have, you can see that the punctuated equilibrium one looks a lot like the phylogenetic trees that we've been looking at versus the gradualism one. Okay, But even though we don't know exactly which one, or even if these are the right ones of how quickly evolution happens, we have evidence of both. So we need to kind of figure out how to mush them together to make the fossil record make sense. Okay, and to this point, the types of evolution we've been talking about are like big evolution. So the evolutions that take, according to the theory right now, that millions and millions and millions of years have to happen before we actually see changes in the fossil record. So this is macro evolution, which is evolution on a large scale and over a long period of time. This is the theory of evolution that we have not been able to prove yet. Okay, so this is the one that says that dinosaurs turned into chickens at some point in time, based on the evidence that we have right now, and only some dinosaurs. We also have microevolution, which is evolution on a small scale. And we do have evidence of microevolution, and we can actually see microevolution happening. And this is something that takes very, very small amounts of time, where again, the whole word evolution can get kind of confusing because we don't really know which one we're talking about. Microevolution is what we can see happening in bacteria and in viruses. So the mutations that build up in those organisms happen so quickly, and we can see them happening. Like there's a ton of studies on microevolution in HIV because of the difficulty in treating that virus and trying to stop people from developing AIDS from this virus. And we've come such a long way with it. But microevolution happens very, very, very quickly. And we can, again, see the changes. We can see those mutations, and they build up in the populations very quickly because they're usually happening in things that reproduce asexually. So macroevolution is like all of the life came from a single cell and eventually turned into a million different things. Microevolution is just like evolution in little things that happens very quickly. And then just going into some evidence of macroevolution, so large scale, long time evolution, is looking about 245 million years ago, based on modern day dating technology. We're looking at the Paleozoic era, which is the second era of time. And we're looking at something called the Cambrian explosion, because during the Cambrian period of the Paleozoic era, when we're looking in the fossil record, basically you go back about 3.5 billion years ago, again, according to modern dating technology, and we have single cell, all of these microscopic fossils that we've been able to find. And then all of a sudden we had this ginormous explosion, an appearance of multicellular life in the fossil record. And this is evidence of something called divergent evolution, so a different term for evolution, where we had one species change and have this speciation process happen extremely rapidly into a ton of different things, because they, again, went from like single cell to like hundreds of these random brand new species in the fossil record with nothing in between. Okay. And another thing that kind of goes hand in hand with macroevolution is the process of extinction. And we have had some major mass extinctions that have happened in the time that we've had life on our planet. There has technically been 5 mass extinctions. You guys probably know about the most recent one, which is, the death of all the poor little dinosaurs. Not so little. That happened about 65 million years ago. There were 4 major ones that happened before then. And with extinction events, we see massive amounts of speciation happening in the fossil record after these events occur. So we've killed off like over 75% of life on the planet in most of the cases. And then the 25% of life that's left on the planet has to, change and find ways to survive. Sometimes that's just based on the adaptations they have. Sometimes it's based on behaviors that they have. but their ability to survive these extinctions means that they can then have speciation occur to them, and they can turn into a bunch of different species. Extinction is happening all the time. We have small little extinction events happening almost daily on our planet, but it's not a mass extinction until you lose at least 3/4 of life on the planet. And our biggest mass extinction, which was the third one that happened in the Permian era, or Permian period, killed off 96% of life on our planet. So we had like a whole 4% of life survive that huge extinction. So the dinosaur one wasn't the biggest one. But they are important again in the changes of the species that we see today. So at the end of the Paleozoic era, which is the era before the one we're in right now, which is the Phanerozoic era, we don't know the causes of the extinctions because they happened so long ago, and the evidence that we have is just not awesome. But some of the extinction events are caused from climate change. So either an increase in the overall climate of the planet or a decrease leading into ice ages. That has impacted life on our planet a lot over time. So climate change has been happening since the beginning of time. It's not a brand new thing. And it has impacted life on our planet since we've had life on our planet. The Permian extinction, again, that one that we lost like almost all of life on our planet. Scientists think it had something to do with the movement of the tectonic plates. So the fact that Earth is made up of a bunch of moving, kind of floating lava islands that sometimes can like bump under each other and make mountains or massive earthquakes or whatever. And the movement of the tectonic plates can cause some massive environmental pressures. Okay, and then we have our Mesozoic extinction, also called the Cretaceous extinction, also called the KT extinction. There's a whole bunch of names for it. But this one, again, is where we had the death of the dinosaurs, and there is evidence of how this one happened and shows that there was already some sort of climate change event going on, whether that was a cooling event or a heating event. There's some argument on what that was. But the dinosaurs were already starting to decline, so they were already starting to die off. They were not adapted well to the environment. Natural selection was selecting against the dinosaurs. And then a meteor came and hit in where the Gulf of Mexico is now. We do have a crater down there, and there is, with the dating technology that we have, so using radiometric dating, the rocks in that area date back to about 65 million years ago, kind of around the same time as when the dinosaurs all disappeared. And once the meteor hit, there was a huge change in temperature that caused it to increase extremely fast for the first little bit. And then that increase caused a massive decrease afterwards because a whole bunch of stuff went up into the atmosphere. And yeah, 75% of life on the planet did not make it through this massive environmental change. There are videos on it if you want to learn more about that, or you can take paleo and we talk about extinctions a whole lot. Okay, even though mass extinctions are sad and a whole lot of the organisms on our planet die, when it comes to change and when it comes to evolution, extinctions are kind of necessary to get rid of a bunch of the organisms that aren't as successful and are already dying off anyways. It just kind of eliminates some of the competition and allows for new species to develop and form. So, sounds kind of callous, but death is needed for change to happen. All right. And that, my friends, is Bio 20. So it was a lot over the last couple of days. I understand, and I do apologize again for not being there. Fortunately, things happen, and it was definitely not how I wanted to spend our last week before the break. But again, fingers crossed that I will be there tomorrow and we can kind of review all of this stuff. And I will post the Jamboards or the online whiteboard type things that I've been drawing from today and from yesterday's lesson so that you guys have everything. And then tomorrow, quick recap, get ready for your quiz on Thursday, which is all of this stuff. Okay. So have a great rest of your day, guys. And I will hopefully see you tomorrow. And I'm using the wrong mouse. All right. See you later, guys.